So we are starting the book of Ruth, and what I'll try to do is tell you kind of where we're going, because, and I feel very needful to do that now, even though we are just starting a new book. I want to kind of give you a guide as to what we're going to do and where we're going to be, because the book of Ruth only has 4 chapters. Okay, so I don't think it's going to take us very long to study this book. Now, y'all know me, I may get on a rant or chase a rabbit or something like that, but in the grand scheme of things, I don't think it's going to take us very long. And so once we finish the book of Ruth, Lord willing, and we're all still able to come, and I'm still teaching this class, we will be looking at how to properly interpret the Bible. Okay, so we've been doing verse-by-verse studies for a long time. 1st, 2nd Peter, and Jude, Esther, Ruth, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. I mean, we've done a lot of verse-by-verse studies, and it's been a while since we've done more of a topical thing. And so I think that'll be a good study, how we can read the Bible and take it for what it truly says without reading our own presuppositions or cultural context into the text. That's something that we don't want to do as Bible students. So that's kind of where we're headed, but of course we are in the book of Ruth. When we start a book, I like to give us a theme verse and a theme phrase. Now, I have to admit, usually when I do this, this is the only time that we see it, and I rarely come back and talk about it. I'm going to try not to do that with the book of Ruth, because theme verses and theme phrases, in my opinion, are very good ways for us to remember what a book is about and remember the central purpose of the book. And so the theme verse is chapter 1 and verse 16, which is by far, in my opinion, the most famous verse in the book of Ruth. It says, "But Ruth replied, 'Do not urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and my God, your God.'" And I have a lot of people who ask for that verse to be read at their wedding ceremony when they're standing there giving their vows. And we'll talk when we get to chapter 1 why that really isn't the best thing to do if you're looking at the verse in its particular context. So there's the theme verse, and it shows what the theme phrase is all about. 2 saving relationships. You have the relationship between Ruth and Naomi that we're going to see explicitly in chapter 1, a beautiful story of a daughter-in-law and mother-in-law and the unity and bonding that they have. And then we're going to see the saving relationship of Boaz and Ruth, ultimately giving into the Davidic line, ultimately leading to the Messiah, Jesus. So there's our theme verse and our theme phrase. I hope that you'll remember that or write it down, because I think it will help us as we study the book of Ruth. So let's talk about authorship. Who wrote the book of Ruth? Well, we don't know. Authorship is not given in the book. And I like when I get to teach books of the Bible, like verse-by-verse textual studies, to college age and teenagers. Because when we go over critical things like this, I think it's very important to address critical issues like this, because if you don't, ultimately, sometimes somebody, especially in their age, is going to say, "Oh, well, we don't know who wrote this, and so how do we know that it's inspired? And if it's not inspired, then why is it in the Bible? And if it's not inspired, then is there really a God?" And you get all these types of questions. So I think it's very important that we go over these things. But it seems that college students and teenagers freak out whenever you tell them that the authorship of a book is not known. But I think we can take comfort in the fact that there are many books of our Bible, especially the New Testament, that don't tell us the author. For example, the book of Hebrews never tells us the author. Honestly, the book of 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John never tell us the author. We assume that it's John based on extra-biblical writing and things like that, but the text itself never tells us. The Gospel of Matthew never tells us that Matthew wrote the Gospel, nor does the Gospel of Mark. Okay, so we have a lot of books that don't tell us who the author is. That really shouldn't be a problem if we know anything about church history and how these books came into the canon of Scripture. But even though we don't know who the author is, that's never stopped us from having an opinion or an educated guess. And so here are 4 really good educated guesses. The Talmud, which is a collection of Jewish rabbinic literature and rabbinic writing, says that Samuel is the author. Well, that may well be, and it stands to reason because, and now just be honest with you, I don't have an opinion one way or the other. And that's saying something coming from me, because I usually have strong opinions about everything, okay? So I have no opinion about this. I think one is just as good as the other. But if Samuel is going to appoint David as king, David does not seem to have the lineage that he needs in order to be king. Okay, he doesn't come from the kingly line. He is a shepherd boy, and so maybe Samuel wrote this to show the Davidic line and to give David somewhat of a pedigree. The same argument could be used that David wrote it himself. A big problem with the idea of David and Solomon writing the book of Ruth is that when you read them in Hebrew and compare them with the Hebrew of the Psalms or of Song of Solomon, Ecclesiastes, things of that nature, the style really doesn't match. And that's not to say that it couldn't be written by them, because language is language and people are people, and you can change whatever you want, that's fine. But it just doesn't seem to be that way. It could have been David talking about his own lineage, telling the story of his great-grandmother. It could have been Solomon telling the story of his great-great-grandmother. I think it is interesting, though, what Teichler says in his notes about it being an unknown woman. That's very interesting. And I really, really like that hypothesis. Now, I don't know that it's true. And that's true with all these. I just don't know. Nobody does. But it seems incredibly strange to have an ancient Jewish writing. And by the way, chapter 1 and verse 1, which we'll talk about in just a moment, talks about this happened when the judges judged. Okay, and so if we're going all the way back to the book of Judges, during that particular time span, and these events are transpiring during that time span, it seems very, very unlikely, very strange, that two women would be the main characters of the story. You say, well, what about Esther? Wasn't Esther the main character of the story? Well, if you remember what we said about the book of Esther, and some of you were here and some of you weren't, the book of Esther is not the main character. Mordecai is the main character. Esther is a supporting character. She's a leading character, but she is a supporting character nonetheless when you look at the narrative of the book of Esther. The exact opposite is true with the book of Ruth. Ruth is the main character, and Boaz is the supporting character. Now, he's an important character. He's a big character. We like Boaz. We identify with him, but Ruth is the main character here. And so I really like this idea of it being an unknown woman. My only question is, why was it preserved? Because if it was written by a woman, it would certainly not have been put in the libraries, or what little libraries they had, or the literature of the day. But at any rate, there are the suggestions. The whole point is, we just simply can't know. So when was the book written? Well, we said earlier that Ruth chapter 1 and verse 1 places the story at the period of the Judges. The word here it's a cognate word, and which basically means it's the same word, one in noun form and one in a verbal form. Hebrew verbs have 3 letters, 3 consonants, okay? And so you can see and you can hear the same verb being made into a noun. The verb is shafot, and the noun is hashafotim. Okay, so you can kind of hear the difference there, but it literally says, when the judges judged. Kind of like what we may say in English, when the preacher preached. Okay, it's taking a noun and making it a verb, or vice versa. And so it seems to be during the period of the Judges, but the book itself says nothing about the date of its composition. Now, what am I saying here? When you look at a book of the Bible and you're asking about the date, there are 2 dates that you have to be concerned with. The date of the actual events, if it's a narrative, and the dates of its composition. Those are 2 different things. So what do I mean? Well, let's think about the Gospel of John. Okay, the Gospel of John, we're looking at the crucifixion, and we say, well, the crucifixion was approximately AD 33 or 35 or somewhere in that range. Okay, great. When was the Gospel of John written? Well, a lot of people say that the Gospel of John wasn't written until the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s. Okay, so that's a long time after the events of the crucifixion, which is a good thing, in my opinion, though other scholars would disagree. But you can look back on those events and see how time has transpired and write based on your certain occasion. So here, the book says nothing about, like I, David, am writing this about my family. So we just simply don't know when the book was written, but as I said earlier, that never stopped anybody from having an opinion. Okay, so you really have two options, and it's this way with dating every book of the Bible. You always have two options: an early date or a late date. So here are some reasons people would suggest a late date, and by late I mean post-exilic. Okay, so we're talking about after the exile. So here are three reasons why people would say that. Reason number one, they would suggest that the book of Ruth contains Aramaisms. Aramaisms. Now, what is that? Well, when you read it in the Semitic language, in its original language, Hebrew would be the language that Ruth is written in. And actually, Ruth is one of the easiest books to read in Hebrew, there alongside of Jonah. You begin to read it, and it seems like there are some Aramaic loanwords, Aramaic not punctuation, but grammar, Aramaic conjugations, things of that nature. So if it was Aramaic, if there are some Aramaisms in the book of Ruth, that would put it after the exile, because when did the Jews learn Aramaic? During the exile, okay? So number two, they claim it had to be written late because it's a misunderstanding of Deuteronomy 25. And I have here verse 9. That's one of many verses in the context. So let's just say Deuteronomy 25. Levirate marriage. Not Levite marriage, Levirate marriage. Which means when, if you die, then your brother has to marry your wife and give her children so that she can be taken care of. Okay, that's Levirate marriage. And they say, well, when you look in the book of Ruth, you have the kinsman redeemer, but they're trying to assimilate that to Levirate marriage, and it's really not Levirate marriage, and therefore it has to be dated late, because if it was dated this close to the Pentateuch, they would not have gotten that mixed up. And lastly, they say it's a late date because the book seems to be written with a coming hope of the Messianic kingdom. So, post-exile, the people of Israel are really looking forward to the coming Messiah. I mean, really looking forward to it. Now, when you get to Malachi, things get kind of leveled out, and people start to get bored because he hasn't come yet, right? Ezekiel chapters 9, 10, and 11 talk about the Spirit of God leaving the temple, and then it's not until John 1:14 that you have the Spirit of God coming and tabernacling on earth in the incarnation of Jesus. And then it's not until, let's say, Luke 3:20-ish, until you have the Spirit descending out of heaven like a dove, and you have a literal embodiment of the Spirit coming back into the worldly realm. Okay, and so people are getting a little frustrated, and so they write these certain writings talking about the coming Messiah, and so that's an argument for the late date. Now, as you probably have guessed, I don't buy any of this. And so, as is often the case in scholarship, it's not until you have one idea that you get another, and the second idea is a refuting of the first. And so that's what you have with the early date. The early date basically says that cannot be right because none of those points make sense if you actually look at it. The argument of Aramaisms has long been obsolete. Like I said, the book of Ruth is one of the easiest books to read in Hebrew. When you take Hebrew grammar 1 and 2, the first book that you read or the first chapter that you read in Hebrew continuously, at least for me, was Ruth chapter 1 and Jonah chapter 1. Okay, it's part of the same thing with John in Greek. You read the Gospel of John, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John in Greek, and that's pretty easy. So there are no Aramaisms in the book. That's been disproven. Number two, with regard to Deuteronomy 25 and the Levirate marriage, there is a difference between being a kinsman redeemer and a Levirate marriage. And this is something that liberal scholars just don't understand, and if they do understand, they refuse to accept it. Okay, we're talking about two different things. So when we come to the book of Ruth and we're talking about Ruth and Boaz being the kinsman redeemer, there is no violation of the law there. And lastly, number three, the book of Ruth does not have a messianic tone. The only traction that skeptics get for talking about this messianic tone and the looking forward to a messianic kingdom is in chapter 4 and the Davidic line. That's all. Because it seems that everyone is looking for this son of David or David to come back and be on his throne. And so there's the little bit of messianic tone. And an argument could be made talking about Boaz as the Redeemer and the parallels that you get between Boaz and Jesus and redeeming and things like that. But if you're reading the text in the context that it was written, you're not looking for a messianic Redeemer. You're reading a narrative. Okay, so I'm not saying that the parallel isn't there. I'm just saying it wouldn't have been as explicit to them as it is to us in the 21st century with, hindsight being 2020. Why was the book written? Well, I think that's a question that we need to ask with every book that we study, because if you can find out why the book was written, you will have a better understanding of the book. There are several reasons suggested. The three that are on the screen are three that have been suggested by scholars, and then I have, I think, three more that I'm suggesting just for me personally. So here's the first one. The providential salvation of Elimelech's family. Now, don't miss this. Providential salvation of Elimelech's family. Okay. First key word is providential. When you go to the book of Ruth and to the book of Esther, these two books that we're studying side by side really, the providence of God is a big theme. We said this many times in the book of Esther. The name of God is not even mentioned, not once. That's not true in the book of Ruth. The book of Ruth mentions the name of God, the Tetragrammaton, many times. But with Esther, you don't have the name of God, but we say, God's fingerprints are all over the book, and you can just see how God led her to this moment and how she took advantage of the moment that God led her to. And I totally agree with that. Absolutely. Here, it seems to be partly the same thing, that God is certainly behind the events that are taking place. And call me a liberal if you want, but I certainly believe that God is behind the events that take place in our life. And I say that based on Ecclesiastes, what Ecclesiastes says about a time to be born, a time to die, the things of that nature, a time for everything. And if you continue reading in Ecclesiastes, you will know that the Bible says, Ecclesiastes says, that God is the bringer of the times, and what you do with the time is up to you. And so I think a lot of people have a hard time saying, well, how much is God in control? How much is God in control of my life? Because if God is in control of my life, like we often pray and like we often sing and say to one another, well, God's in control. If God is truly in control, then how much free will do I truly have? And that's my answer, that God is in control of bringing us to these opportunities and these times and these certain situations, but what we do with that is up to us. That's my opinion. You can have your own. So here we have the providential salvation of Elimelech's family. Now, Elimelech in chapter 1 is a husband to Naomi, and he and Naomi have two sons, Mahlon and Chilion, and Elimelech, Mahlon, and Chilion all die. Spoiler alert. Okay? They're all gone. How is it that a woman is going to be able to provide for herself, in this context, in this culture, without a man. Now, this is absolutely no knock against women, okay? An interesting study, by the way, if somebody wants to do this in their spare time, is to read the book of Ruth and read what feminists have said about the book of Ruth. So, it's the providential salvation of his family, because it's not so much about Ruth and her being in this salvation, it's about his family. Which is kind of interesting because by the time Ruth and Boaz get together, it seems like Mylon and Killian are pretty well forgotten. Number two, political purpose illustrating the line of David. We talked about this when we talked about authorship. Maybe David wrote it, talking about his pedigree. Maybe it was written to be a political thing, saying that here's the story of his family. And that's to say, number three, to give David's kingship validity. So here are my three. I think it was written to talk about a Gentile acceptance into the Messianic line. Ruth is a Moabite woman. It drives me insane when I hear preachers and teachers talk about how Gentiles were not allowed into the family of God in the Old Testament. Are you kidding? You clearly haven't read the book of Ruth, because Ruth is a Moabite. She is not an Israelite, but she becomes a proselyte. How many ites can we have in the sentence? So she becomes a proselyte. She is a part of the worshiper of Yahweh God. And she then is introduced into the line of the Messiah. I find it very interesting. And few people realize this, even less preachers, that Jesus, his own pedigree, is not 100% pure if you're looking at nationalistic Israelite. No, she's not the only one. She's not. And you can go to the lineage and find that, but people just keep, it's a pet peeve of mine because people just refuse to read the Bible. So I think one big reason is to talk about Gentile acceptance, and I say that also in mind with the prophets, the minor prophets especially. And even go back to Exodus chapter 3 and even on to the plagues. The whole purpose of the plagues was twofold. Number one, to be evangelistic to the Jews, and number two, to be evangelistic to Egypt. So there's one. Number two, familial devotion. When Kayla and I were doing premarital counseling, Dr. David Powell told me to read the book of Song of Solomon, and after I've read it, write Kayla a letter. And she was to read that the night of our rehearsal dinner, okay? And then he told Kayla, read the book of Ruth, and once you've read the book of Ruth, write Joshua a letter, and he can read it the morning of the wedding, okay? So that's what we've done. And I really, really enjoyed that exercise. And so now when I do premarital counseling with people, I make them both. And I don't mind reading the Song of Solomon. I know some people would have a problem with that. But I'm not going to tell someone who's not studied biblical literature to just pick up the Song of Solomon and read it, because I don't think you can understand it just picking it up and reading it. There's a lot of euphemisms in there that we'll just not talk about. But anyways, I make them both read the book of Ruth, but not for the reason that Dr. Powell asked us to read it. See, Dr. Powell asked us to read the book of Ruth because it shows a devotion of a husband and wife, and, Ruth staying by Boaz's side, and just a beautiful picture of marriage there. I asked them to read it because of the picture in chapter 1 that you get between in-laws. Okay? I guess, let's see, just about everybody in here is either married or has been married for a number of years. I can tell you right now, if you don't have a good relationship with your in-laws when you get married, life is going to be miserable for you. Okay? I'm sorry. And I'm sure some of you are sitting there thinking, you're talking about me. Right? Well, that's the way it is. I love you, John. Only on days that end in Y. No, I'm just teasing. I've got the greatest in-laws in the world, and I'd say that even if you weren't here. But the purpose here to show that devotion, notice how many times in chapter 1 when we get there, notice how many times the word daughter-in-law is used, and notice how many times the word daughter is used. Daughter-in-law is used by the author, whomever he or she is, and daughter is used by Naomi in direct speech. I love that. I love that. I hate that we have put the tag in-law on familial relationships, but that's just the way it is. And lastly, I do think that this was written to be an illustration of the Redeemer. You have the kinsman Redeemer with Boaz, you have the Redeemer with Jesus Christ, and I think that has a New Testament tone, very much so. Whether they realized it in writing it or not, it certainly has that New Testament tone. One more thing that I didn't put on here about the purpose of the book of Ruth. There are 5 books of the Old Testament that are read at certain feast days. For example, the book of Esther, we talked about last week, is read at the Feast of Purim, right? The book of Ruth is read at the Feast of Pentecost. Now that makes a lot of really good sense if you think about it, because Pentecost is 50 days after Passover, and it's a celebration of the harvest. Well, what's Ruth doing when she meets Boaz? Harvesting, right? She's going out and she's gleaning in the fields, okay? So let's talk about the outline of the book here. How do we break it down? Well, you have an introduction in chapter 1, verses 1 through 5. We're going to be introduced to I won't say the main characters, but we're introduced to the situation that's going to put Naomi and Ruth together as connected. And then in verse 6 of chapter 1 through verse 18, which is the rest of chapter 1, you have what I'm calling the Exodus, and that is the journey from Bethlehem to Moab, where they go to, it's been called the fields of Moab, the plains of Moab, the country of Moab. It's a very loose term in Hebrew, and so they're going to, I'll say, the land of Moab, and they'll live there for 10 years, and then they return to Bethlehem in chapter 1, verses 19 through 22. And they return because they've heard that there's food in Bethlehem. There's a famine at first that brings them to Moab, and then there's food back, and they go back to Bethlehem after losing Elimelech, Mahlon, and Chilion. Then in chapter 2, Boaz is introduced. In chapter 3, there's the plan for the kinsman redeemer, and chapter 4 is going to be the public pronouncement, and then the end with the what I call the postlude. It's the lineage of David. Okay, I think it's very interesting, though, that out of 85 verses in 4 chapters, 50 of these verses are direct speech. And so what that means for us as biblical students is that the plot of the story is going to be introduced to us by the mouth of those who are involved. Okay, so it's not that you have somebody sitting back writing about this who is so distant that he or she doesn't know what's going on. The plot is going to be given by direct speech. One more thing before we give it a break, I guess. The literary style of the book, I would suggest that this is a narrative, just like Esther. And the problem with narrative, at least for our study, is that you start reading, it's the same thing we had with Esther, right? You start reading, and then here, of course, because we only meet for, 40 minutes on a Wednesday night, we'll have to stop and then wait 7 days and come back and pick it up again. So I want to encourage you to do the same thing that I asked you to do with the book of Esther. And that is to go home sometime this week and read the book of Ruth if you've not done so recently, and read it all in one sitting. And if you can find something online that has it without chapter or verse divisions, I'll give you 10 brownie points that you can use later. Okay? So the genre is a big deal because people disagree about all this stuff. Herman Gunkel, who is a very famous form critic, and what form criticism is it's determining how a work was put together. Okay, so for example, form criticism of Genesis may say, well, how do we know that it was all written by one person? Or how do we know that the collection of the oral tradition of the stories of Adam and Eve and Babel and Cain and Abel and so forth came through the ways that it needed to? So appreciate the work that Hermann Gunkel, a German scholar, did, but I disagree with about 98% of what he had to say. He saw the book as a novella, and what that means is it's an extended story. Now, I think that takes it a little far for it being as short as it is, but that's just me. I think it's a narrative short story, and I think it's interesting here that some have even gone so far as to say it's a historical short story. Now, that's interesting because a lot of people in biblical scholarship do not believe in the validity or the historicity of the written text as it's presented. And so I think it's just very interesting to see some of our liberal scholars call it a historical short story. I call it a historical narrative. So when we evaluate the text of a document, style is very important. Style is going to show us how the narrative flows. It's going to show us pauses and insertions and things like that. We've already talked about how the Hebrew is very simple. The power of the message is found in its simplicity. And isn't that the way the Bible is? I mean, the Bible can present some very difficult, deep things in some of the simplest ways. And that's the beauty of it, because the Bible, if we truly believe that the Bible is inspired, that means that the Bible is a living, breathing thing. And so you can read it once and understand the things that you need to understand. But you can study it for a lifetime and always find something new about it. Well, I love that, and that's the way the book of Ruth has been for me. It's one of the first books that I ever studied in the Old Testament, and it just gets more powerful every time you read it. Home, family, emptiness, and fullness engulf the narrative. And so I think what we're going to find is pictures of opposites. When Naomi and Elimelech begin in chapter 1, they are full. Even when Naomi comes back, she's telling people, I went out full and came back empty. And then there's going to be a continuation of how does she and Ruth gain that fullness yet again. Okay, I'm out of time, but I'm definitely looking forward to getting into the text next week. I appreciate you sitting through what's probably the most boring part of our study with all of this information being thrown your way, but I will encourage you, as I have already, please read the book and read it all in one setting. So thank you all for your attention. Look